Tonight we're going to be hearing about Mike W.R. Davis's current book, The St. Clair River, as you see the cover of the book on the screen. Mike was a Bicknell lecturer in September 2008 when he presented a program related to his previous book, General Motors Centennial, and again in March of this year when he spoke about Detroit's area test tracks. Mike is an author, journalist, and historian. He's also the author of this is the 11th book, Mike?
Right.
Including America's Favorite Homes, The Ford Fleet, The Technology Century, the Engineering Society of Detroit Centennial book, General Motors, A Historic History, Chrysler Heritage, A Photographic History, The Ford Dynasty, A Photographic History, Detroit's Wartime Industry, Arsenal of Democracy, and Detroit Area Test Tracks. He's currently seeking a publisher's history of an American medical unit in World War I, tentatively titled Forsaken Angels in Their Own Words. Mike earned a BA in American History from Yale, an MS in Cultural Geography and Historical Preservation from Eastern Michigan University, and has completed coursework towards a doctorate in History of Technology from Wayne State. He's a former national director of the Pioneer American Society Association of Preservation of Artifacts and Landscape, past president of the Algonquin Club of Detroit and Windsor, former chairman of the Board of Trustees of the National Automotive History Collection, the Detroit Public Library, and former president of the Yale Alumni Association of Michigan. He was a reporter for the Miami Daily News and Business Week before spending 27 years in public relations and marketing at Ford Motor Company and the Evening News Association. Subsequently, he was the executive director of the Detroit Historical Museum for 5 years, at which time he also served as the director of the University Cultural Association. He's been adjunct professor of architectural history at Eastern Michigan, and is the historian and regional director of the Defense Orientation Conference Association. As a freelance journalist, he's contributed countless magazines, newspapers, and trade journals. As a scholar, he's made numerous presentations at universities and scholarly meetings. He serves on the advisory panel of the nomination for the Automotive Hall of Fame and the Detroit chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. He's a member of the Automotive Press Association, Society of Automotive Historians, Sons of the American Revolution, Society of War of 1812, Sons of the Union Soldiers, and Military Order of the Legal Legion of the United States. He was born in Buffalo, New York, and grew up in Louisville, but has been a resident of the Detroit area since 1957, and has been a member for over 50 years of Christ Church Cranbrook, where he served as a church teacher and vestry member. Mike Davis. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you very much, Mike. It's nice to be back here again. And remind me next time we talk, shorten my biography.
This is a whole other crowd than the last time. You're right.
Well, they don't need to know all that stuff.
Oh, sure. Come on.
But I found that my remote doesn't work, so you'll have to press the...
You got it. No problem. Okay. I'm ready.
Just the down arrow.
Yep.
Everything works right. There we go. So that's sort of a shot of books that I have had published and some that I would like to get published. In some cases, if I ever get them written. In other cases, they're trying to find a home. Next. Okay. Well, usually people are curious to know, particularly since I'm a landlubber, how come I did a book about the St. Clair River. And the answer is that Tom Dennis of the Algonquin Club asked me to do a book on it. And I said, he took me to lunch, in fact, freeloaded. And he said, I want you to do a book on the St. Clair River. And I said, I don't know anything about the St. Clair River. Why don't you do a book on the St. Clair River? And he said, no, I'm just a draftsman. You're the historian. Well, I tried to find some other people to do it and who live up that way, other writers, and I was not successful. So anyway, how do you do a photographic history when half of the history predates the invention of photography? Well, the answer is maps and artwork, but it takes a hell of a lot of work, if you pardon the expression, to find those to fit the story. I'm a storyteller, and I had to finally figure out what the history of the river was, doing all the research. I had to figure out what's the story, what's the what can you do that's more than just a scrapbook of pictures? What's the story? So, let's start with the earliest map that we have of the waters hereabouts, which dates from, we don't know when, but sometime in the 1600s, an early map of the area, and you can readily see that compared to maps we do today with satellites and so forth, the river looks a lot fatter than it is, and the islands in the delta a lot bigger, extending out into Lake St. Clair. Notice that it has the French spelling of Lake St. Clair. Okay, next. So when the French first arrived here in the 17th century, what did they find? They were the Europeans. And what did they find? Well, they found Indians in birch bark canoes. It's become politically correct to call these Native Americans, and in Canada, they use a better expression for my money, which is First Nations people. But I found in dealing with some Indians that they prefer to be known as Indians. So much for political correctness. Next, please. This is a art of a drawing, in effect, of an early settlement, and you can see the Catholic priest in front of the cross preaching to the Indians. The Indians are living in huts made of animal skins. And there's a log house that you can see where presumably Father whoever stayed, and there are canoes to be seen about. You saw the small canoe, we call it a two-man or two-braid canoe a couple of slides back. But the truck of the times was a cargo canoe, also called a Montrealer. And this picture happened to have been taken during a reenactment a couple of years ago, right up at Metropolitan Beach, and I got this excellent photograph from one of the interpreters there. But this is more typical of the canoes that operated in these waters in the early French times, a large canoe. Now, what drew these French explorers here? There were two groups. There were the priests who were going to convert the Indians to Christianity, we just saw that a second ago. And the other were the trappers who were after this little guy, the beaver. Next. And beavers, we don't see too many of these around here anymore. This photograph actually came from Wyoming, of all places. But that's a beaver lodge there, that big pile of fallen trees and whatnot. I had a place in the Adirondack Mountains for a number of years, and on a very long, narrow lake, similar to what you think of as a river. Looks like a river. It's about the width of the St. Clair in its narrowest parts. And there was one of these right across from our cabin. And those pesky little guys, I'd come in there in the spring and I'd find out that they had gnawed down my young birch trees and hauled them off to build their lodges. This is a beaver pelt. This was what the trade was all about. Now the pelt, the animal has been killed and skinned, and the pelt, the fur is left, and it was mounted inside this rack, which was made of willow twigs or limbs or whatever. As you know, they're very flexible. There was a fad which lasted a couple hundred years in Europe for beaver hats, and for all I know, lots of other things made of beaver fur, but beaver hats in particular were the big fad. And they killed off all the beavers in northern Europe, so there was a ready market for the beaver furs that they found here. Next. The first ship, the first European type ship on the Great Lakes was the Griffin, which was built with Frenchmen directing and Indians doing the labor near Buffalo at the eastern end of Lake Erie. It came out here, so this was this rendering by a modern artist is I think much more historically accurate than some of the historic art of this ship. Nobody ever sat down to paint the ship and in fact, it was lost in a storm on Lake Michigan within a short time of when it was launched. But that's what it looked like. It looked like just like the ships that were crossing the Atlantic. The English displaced the French here after the French and Indian War, and this fort on the Pine River was built by the British in 1765, I believe. This is a model of it, which is at the museum in St. Clair. Now, fast forward a few years to the War of 1812, and the fate of this part of the country was sealed by Perry's victory in the Battle of Lake Erie. This is a rendering of that piece of art that hangs in the Naval Academy Museum in Annapolis. Next, and that, winning that battle meant that the Americans had control of the Detroit River, the St. Clair River, and so on, everything above it. But the settlement didn't actually get going much until the Erie Canal opened. It was built between 1825 and 1830 across New York State. This is a view from a town where my late wife family was from, between Syracuse and Rochester. Right after the War of 1812, the first steamship was built on that same eastern end of Lake Erie and launched, and it too eventually came to a bad end. I don't know if this scene of it being washed ashore in a violent storm and people getting off was the one that did it in. But the interesting thing was they managed to scavenge the boilers and the machinery out of it, the first steamship on the Great Lakes, and put it in something else. Next. Now, turning now to the St. Clair River in particular, what drew people there? Well, it was the fruits of the water, which I've already described, the beaver on the left, and also fishing. Now, this is, of course, obviously a much later picture of fishing. Amazing how hard it is to find pictures of these things. And next, the fruits of the air, namely ducks. They're your duck hunters, probably around the turn of the century. And the fruits of the land, which were the forests, which covered what's now St. Clair County. Next. This ship, the Friends Goodwill, is a replica of one that was actually in the Battle of Lake Erie. Its ownership or possession crossed back and forth between the British and Canadians, as you were, and the Americans, and it eventually, it survived the battle, and it was a commercial, that is to say, a cargo, mainly cargo-carrying vessel in these waters, including in Lake St. Clair, or in Lake St. Clair and the St. Clair River. The replica was built and is based, I suppose, owned at the Michigan Maritime Museum, which I think is in South Haven, or Lake Michigan. This is an interesting painting because it shows the three modes of shipping that were going on simultaneously on the waterways around here. Namely, a side wheel steamer on the center and the left, a sailing vessel on the right, and here's a, I don't know what you call it exactly, but powered by oars and also looks like it has a mast for a small sail. So you had those three operating together, sail, steam, and oars. Next. And then there was a kind of an interesting hybrid type of vessel which sailed these waters, a mixture of sails and steam. Now, as any of you who operate on the waters of the St. Clair River, you know there's quite a strong current, about 5 miles an hour, that comes down from Lake Erie. So it's tough for a sailboat on its own to go up that river. But with the aid of steam, it can make headway. Steam also assists in keeping the ship from foundering in the severe storms that you can get on the lakes around here, because we don't know. The next important evolution was combined between screws. In other words, as I showed you a second ago, the Great Lakes ships, the steamships originally were side wheelers, not stern wheelers like you find on my Ohio River, but they were side wheelers. And so the invention of the metal screws and all the gearing to turn them, plus steel hulls, another major advance. Now, one of the things about steel hulls is, of course, they don't burn like wooden hulls. And you have to remember that back in those days, people used, the steam boilers were fired by coal, burning coal, and the lighting at night came from kerosene lanterns and candles, I suppose. So combined with wooden surroundings, they were very subject to fires. Also true of buildings, as we see. Next. Then we get into what I call the beginning of the modern era, familiar era, so to speak, of ships, of vessels on these waterways, St. Clair in particular. This was an early ore carrier. It's quite small. I think it was wooden hull. I couldn't find out for sure. 1886. Always, when these new technologies came in, they didn't instantly replace what was out there. So you'd have a mixture of wooden hulls and sailing ships and steamships and so on. Wooden hulls and steam. Now, the next development, of course, were excursion boats. This is one of these postcard shots of the Canoes leaving Detroit docks for its regular daily journey up through the islands and all the ports from the old club all the way up to Port Huron and back every day, and it also went down to Lake Erie. And Tashmo Company indeed had its own parks and things. Now, the next significant development in shipping on the Great Lakes was the combination of lake and ocean freighters. These were built during World War I of a dimension that was determined by the size of the Wellington Canal, which connects Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. And it was at the time 262 feet more or less long, so you couldn't have the ship longer than that. So if you, but it was, there were a lot of shipbuilding companies in the Great Lakes. The government contracted for a lot of these boats, and at the end of the war, Henry Ford bought a bunch of them, a couple of hundred of them, and most of them went into the Rouge foundry, but he kept back about 13 of these to ship Model T parts all over the world. This was one, the Lake Oswego of these, part of the Ford fleet. You can see the Ford sign on the stack. And I don't know where this cross-hatching came from that showed up on the slide, but I couldn't figure out easily how to get rid of it. However, it's appropriate because in February of 1942, this ship was torpedoed off of Newfoundland by a German submarine and sunk with all hands. It was carrying munitions to Murmansk for the Russians. So that cross-hatching, if you can imagine, that was the German submarines. The next development, of course, were the bulk carriers, which we still have on the lakes. This was one of the first ones. Oops, typographical error.
1923.
1924.
Yeah, 23, 24, yeah.
1924 was launched. I won't tell you all the problems I had at the last minute with my slides. Try and get it right. Next, please. And then we have the recreational boats, which first sailing ships is on, or sailing boats is on the left, and then with the growth of Chris Craft in particular, and lots of others, but Chris Craft in particular, is on the right. This is about 1925 vintage Chris Craft. Now notice that the steering wheel is on the left, and as you know, boat steering wheels today are reversed from what they are for us driving on our highways. So I don't know if that, if the boating industry hasn't settled down to making up their minds we're going to do right or left-hand drive, or whether this was one that was built for the English market, because the English market was, or the British Empire market was quite important for Chris Pratt. Next. Now let's go into Riverside Development. What I tried to find in this book were the common elements that applied to all of the towns, villages, cities along the river on the American side. The publisher didn't want me to touch canvas, so I didn't. Well, obviously the biggest thing was lumbering. I showed you the slide of forests, a bit back, and here they're harvesting the lumber. It's a horse or mule-drawn wagon. This would take these huge logs to probably a temporary rail, either a rail siding or a stream, like the Black River or the Pine River or the Bell River. They're not very big streams, but they could float an amazing amount of logs. Anyway, they'd float them downstream to where they had lumber mills, or put them on ships to take them to Detroit, where there were lumber mills. Next. What else happened along the riverside? Well, farming. Once they cleared the trees, then farming was a possible and successful enterprise, particularly to feed Detroit. Because Detroit was growing hugely in this time, along with the Industrial Revolution. Shipyards and all kinds of metalworking, making stoves, making railroad cars, and so on. So food had to come from someplace, and St. Clair County was a major source. Another common kind of development along the river was extraction, and I chose this, which was the digging out clay in order to make bricks. You get the clay and then you put it in ovens, bowls, and so on. You make bricks because they needed bricks to build buildings, particularly. Yes, they could use wood, but brick was also available. And as you'll see, there were some huge factories that were made out of brick. Next, please. Now, as you probably all know, there was shipbuilding all along the Detroit River, and I don't know about Lake St. Clair, but certainly up the St. Clair River, there were shipyards, major shipyards in Marine City, in St. Clair, and of course in Fort Yard. It's amazing to me that this huge shipyard was on the Pine River. You know, I'm sure if you've driven up to St. Clair, you know what a small little wandering, twisting stream it is. It's just amazing to me. This ship that's on the ways there in 1887 is interesting. I couldn't tell or find out if it's a wooden or a steel hull, but you can see from the twin stacks that it had 2 steam engines, which gave it twice the power of some of the earlier steamers I showed you with just 1 stack. That shipyard was taken over by Great Lakes Engineering, by the way, and they were building steel hull ships there, and I found out from Bob Cosgrove's presentation on the first Detroit River Tunnel, the railroad tunnel, that the tunnel sections were made in the St. Clair Yard. Well, here's an example of one of these huge brick buildings serving the agricultural industry, sugar beet processing. Now, sugar beets were and still are a big crop in the Thumb, as you probably know. And I had no idea it dated back into the 19th century. The other image that I had of this same kind of thing is of a chicory factory. Chicory. Now, the thing that the chicory, which is a weed, a pretty little flower, but it's still a weed, that there was that much demand for chicory in the tail end of the 19th century. Next. So then what happened, of course, is people were employed in farms, in shipyards, in factories, lumbering and whatnot, and towns began to develop. I have a series of these in the book, taken more or less in the same location in Algonac, and I decided this had to be after the invention of electric lighting and the telephone because of the utility bills there. So I just guessed at 1885. This is a bird's eye view of Port Huron, which is not in my book, by the way, for entirely different reasons. But you can see Port Huron in 1867 was a very busy and going establishment, as was Sarnia across the river. With all of this, infrastructure had to be developed. Now, I just happened to, I like this as an old police reporter, fire chaser. I picked this image of a fire in, I think, Marine City. But these kind of things were fairly common. So one of the first things that they had to organize was a fire department. And as you may know, originally fire departments were all volunteer or insurance company operated. But there were all kinds of other infrastructures. Probably the first infrastructure in any community would have been a church. And then schools, depending. Schools came in, public schools came in 1840s. And government offices, because all kinds of transactions that you do, buying and selling property, for example, voting, endless, paying taxes, require government buildings and government people at the local level, and so on. The other part of the Riverside Development, I call it, was boat building, symbolized by Chris Smith. Now, here's Chris with his hand-built duck boats, which were used for hunting and fishing, particularly for the wealthy people coming up from Detroit or other places who wanted to go hunting and fishing in the Harson's Island area. And Chris and his brother were both guides, and he designed and built these little, they look almost like kayaks to me, made of wood. And some of his wealthy customers said, "Chris, would you build me one of those?" And that was the genesis of the Chris Craft Motor Boat. Yes. And that became a giant corporation. This was an aerial taken when it was still very active. You can see the factories and their, which is now a marina down here at the bottom, and way off in the distance you can see the St. Clair River. The factory is off of the north channel of the river. The other thing which you find kind of surprising up here is automobile manufacturing. This was the Wills St. Clair plant when it had just started building in 1920. You can see they were using beasts of burden to help move stuff around the building site while they were erecting the steel.
That's still a Chrysler plant, too. That's a,
Well, we did this.
sorry, getting ahead of you, sorry.
So here's the
I don't have the horsey stuff.
Yeah,
here's the
where's
Wills
the
St. Clair
car?
car, a very spiffy car, and had a lot of advanced technology. For a variety of reasons, it was a flop. They managed to produce, presumably sell, because everything produced eventually gets sold. Only a handful more than 12,000 in 6 years. So it flopped. But later, it was sold, the property was sold to Chrysler, who turned it into what's now their National Parts Depot. For a long time, it was where Chrysler built marine engines. But it's a huge facility, and you can see the river in the upper left-hand corner. Transportation. What supplanted the river? The river starts out as the road. The river and the lakes are the roads throughout this part of the United States, and actually down the Mississippi and so on. But so-called modern transportation began coming with the Industrial Revolution in the middle of the 19th century. This is the earliest photo I could find of a railroad. This is a work train on the bridge over the Clinton River, on the line that went from Detroit to Port Huron. Interurbans came in the 1890s. They were electric, and they required the building of a lot of bridges which were welcomed by the local people in place of the rickety old things in which they were crossing by foot and horse and horse and wagon. This was at St. Clair, where the bridge, there's a more modern bridge now over the Pine River there, just north of where the salt company is. Getting to something that's probably dearer to your hearts is this 1895 map, which locates a lot of the clubs and hotels which were along the South Channel of the St. Clair. Here's Parsons Island. Notice how it was spelled in Herson, who knows. Of all of these, of course, only the Old Club and the Riverside Hotel are left, as far as I can tell. Now, there are probably some experts who could educate me on that. And I tried to identify them and have both historical photos and contemporary photographs of them.
Oh, sorry. Yep.
Okay. There were a lot of these huge resort hotels, not only along that South Channel, but up. This is in St. Clair. This hotel, basically, on that property, it predated the salt company, the Diamond Tea Salt Company. South of the Pine River. North of the Pine River, there was another, which is sort of where the shopping center is now. Huge hotel. Now, cottages. People built cottages. They came on these excursion boats and excursion trains. I'll get to that in a minute, because I've got to make Bob Cosgrove coffee. But these were called houses built on stilts. As you know, that area on the south of Parsons Island going out to where the old club is, there are lots of little islands and all kinds of little canals, waterways running away. So if you want to build something, you got to build it on stilts. And so this is from a postcard, probably about 1900, somewhere in that. These postcards are very popular in that 1895 to 1910 period. Over here is, I think, possibly that Riverside Hotel, which has had many names through the years. And without cheating and opening up my book to look, I can't tell you what it's called today, but hasn't been very active lately. Anyway, they all had their little docks, and it was called Venice of America because of all these canals and so on. Okay, well, this is obviously a contemporary picture of the Blue Water Bridge between Port Huron at the bottom and Sarnia at the top. We will cross it many times. This photograph was given to me by the editor of a newspaper up in the Thumb, which is called the Thumbprint. And the woman editor generously shared these with me. And finally, that's another view which just shows how twisty and turny the St. Clair River is at that point, just south of Lake Huron and the lighthouse. It twists and turns. It's very tricky. That's it.
That's it.
Well, 40 slides is usually about enough. I stretched it a bit to 50, but at that point, I'm going to chop it off and say, if you want to see more pictures of all this, buy the book.
Buy the book. Very good.
I'll take care.
Questions, please? Go ahead. Questions for Mike?
No one? Yes, sir.
Bob.
You mentioned that Chris Craft sold a lot in England.
Yes. Yeah, I judge, again, what I know about Chris Craft history came from reading books that other people had done about it. But they were very successful worldwide. Now, the business really got going on account of racing boats. And there just wasn't room enough in this to go into a lot of detail on it, but senior moment here. The other guy who was doing racing boats there.
Harwood.
Right. He had Smith build him some racing boats, which he set about to make records, and then he invested in Chris Craft in the teens, and they had some kind of a dispute or a spat. according to some sources, because Smith built a boat for somebody else that beat out his investor. So he went off and had his own boat company for a while, until 1947. And he had his plan in Marysville, started in Algonac. Just wasn't room to get into this in this presentation tonight. Again, it's in the book. But that really got it made motorboating popular, recognizing that sailboating was the norm, and maybe yachts for the extremely wealthy, but the popularity of these runabouts, shown here on the cover, was very great in the 20s, and it got a big boost from Prohibition, because the bootleggers got these to run booths across the river and into the mazes of the Venice of America and whatnot. And then the Treasury Department agents had to buy their speedboats, comparable or better, faster speedboats from Chris Craft also. So they both got a big boost from Prohibition. It's a funny thing, when I asked in these various museums that I raided for all their pictures up along the river, when I asked about Prohibition, nobody wanted to talk about it. I have a feeling that some of their family fortunes were illegal in these days. But it really was funny. They just didn't, nobody wanted to talk about it.
And Mike, Diamond Jack boats, always on Memorial Day, they have a cruise from Detroit.
Yeah.
To Port Huron and back.
Your suggestion, I started off with that as part of my research, to go up there to Lake Huron and then back.
That's a great trip.
Get a feeling for it. And this past Memorial Day, I set off to take my oldest daughter on the same trip, and the boat engine quit just south of St. Clair, and we drifted into somebody's private dock and into summon buses and all that. Penny loved it. She didn't buy it. She wants to come next year, but she didn't get to Port Huron. She had a great time as far as the trip went. And Larry Sullivan, who's sitting here, also gave Penny and me a ride in his fishing boat across St. Clair and into past Harson's Island and everything last fall, as I was sort of wrapping this up, and I was able to take some pictures to get some contemporary pictures. And so I'm indebted to a whole lot of people for help on putting this book together because of my beginning ignorance. Rob?
Were the Sea Ray boats made in the St. Clair River? Cornelius Ray was an Indian villager.
I don't know. I don't know. I didn't find any records in the Algonac Clay Township Museum, which
I
had
pictured them in
most of the information on those kinds of boats. Marine City had a lot of information on their big boats, because they had shipyards up that tiny little, I call it a creek where I come from, the Bell River. Yes, sir.
And Lake St. Clair is a very shallow lake, and so when there were the smaller boats, it was the depth of the lake wasn't a problem. But by the time you get to 1925, obviously they had to dredge the lake and all. Could you comment on? Do you know anything about how that was financed, or how that impacted the economy up in?
Big, I guess, as far as I know, was when the St. Lawrence Seaway opened, and therefore there would be sea-going ships,
Right.
or ocean-going ships, salties they call them, coming all the way into the Great Lakes, and they definitely had to dig out a channel of, I think it's 26 feet, channels for those kind of ships. And I'm astounded it wasn't done earlier for the ore boats, actually. But so that was in about 1958. I think that's when the Seaway opened. And if you're familiar with the charts, of course, they show the depths. And you're right, everything is very shallow, including in the Bicknell River, except in the channel that's straight. And of course, a lot of these islands, including that island which is on the south or east side or southeast of the South Channel, that's that island is from digging up to provide safe passage the
Right.
deep growing ships.
And my guess would be, when the boats were smaller, a lot of the Port Huron and all the cities along the river would get some kind of commerce benefit from the boats there. But when they got
Oh,
bigger,
huge, yeah.
but when they got bigger,
Chandler's
did that
and,
impact the other way?
There were
That-
small hotels in all of those towns, not the big resort hotels, but the small hotels, verandas out looking over the river and so on,
Mhm.
and all kinds of stores.
And so was the
Service.
adverse effect of the big ships going through and not stopping primarily when the St. Lawrence Seaway opened? Or was it earlier?
Don't know.
Ocean going ships.
Clearly, the problem is that the whole urban renewal movement struck Algonac and St. Clair, and to a lesser extent, Port Huron. And so a lot of those 19th century waterfronts
Excuse me.
done away with in favor of parks and so on, which is fine. But only Marine City still has its water street reasonably well packed. But I don't know what the driving force was for the unique failure of those kinds of businesses in those towns, where it's any different from the Walmart, similar small town businesses everywhere.
Is the Welland Canal the same size today as it was?
Oh, no, it's been enlarged twice, because these ocean-going vessels, I don't know if the Welland can handle 1,000 foot,
No.
but 800 maybe.
760.
Yeah, well, that sure beats the hell out of 260.
Yeah, for sure. Question over here.
Yes, sir.
When did they start the ferry service to Canada out of Marine City?
If you even look at a Coast Guard charts from even the early 80s, there were a lot more ferries crossing then than there are today. Today, you've got basically the small one at Marine City, and you've got the one at Algonac that goes to...
Walpole. Walpole Island.
It's not Marcy, that's not...
Walpole Island. Walpole Island?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay. Plus, the little ferry that goes to us. But there used to be, for example, Robert's Landing, there was a ferry from there to Canada that shows it was 1980.
I can't remember that.
Well, you know, the growth of popular recreational vehicles probably has something to do with that. And all the rigmarole of the immigration and customs and so forth. But in any event, I don't really have a good solid answer to your question. Can't think of that.
Are there still tribal lands along the river?
There are on the Canadian side,
Big
as you know, Walpole Island, there's a big Indian reservation. It's the same people, the same Native Americans, whatever it is, the
First
Canadians
Nation.
call them, Indians, whatever, on both sides. But they've just been, they've settled in Canada with legal vote. But they were the same. In my book, I have a picture from about 1900 of one of the popular attractions for people who come up here from as far away as St. Louis. They come up to this area for the summer or for maybe a week in the summer. And one of the popular attractions in the Parsons Island area, I think it was on Russell Island, in fact, there was an Indian wares, I'll call it, shop. They had real Indians selling their goods. But those Indians came from Canada. They were all the American Indians were gone.
What was the name of the tribe?
They could probably get away with naming any Indian
Was it
tribe.
Ojibwe? Ojibwe, wasn't it, I think?
I don't know, I forgot. I'm not even sure that I identified it in the book. Because for one thing, a lot of those tribes have several names. You know, there's a Canadian name, there's an American name, there's their own name for themselves, and so on. So you can't definitively say, well, they're Ojibways or whatever. Jim Conway is going to be talking to you in a few months. He is the expert on this kind of stuff. Save those questions for Jim.
You want to comment on Sea Harold Wills doing boats and his connection?
Well, yeah, Wills, again, I talk about it a little bit in the book, but, and I've also done an article on him in the car for Automobile Portable for the next issue, which should be out by now. Wills was one of several engineering and manufacturing geniuses who worked for Henry Ford from the very early days. He was sort of known popularly as the chief engineer of Ford Motor Company in the early days, but as some of you may know, nobody had really formal titles in Ford Motor Company except Henry. He had a verbal agreement, handshake at best, with Henry that he would share in the profits, that Henry would pay Wills some amount, forgotten, 10% or something of the profits that Henry was making. Well, after World War I, when there was something of a breakup of the Ford family group, not the genetic family, but the company family, Wills elected to take his share from Henry.
About 1.5 million.
Well, I forgot just how, but yeah, something like that. But if you put it into today's dollars, it was a lot more. It was
Yeah.
70 million or something like that. And he used that he had his own idea of what an automobile ought to be, and he poured a lot of, he not only built his factory in Marysville, but he and another one of the Ford executives who went in with him, they bought a huge amount of land along the river at Marysville. In fact, Marysville is named after
His mother.
mother's wife. And they not only built the factory, but they built a company town there. In other words, it was a real estate development. There were 3 or 4 different companies. There was the manufacturing company, there was the real estate company, which developed, and their idea was that they would sell plots of land to suppliers, to supplier factories that would be next door to their automobile company. But they also built housing for their employees, not for free. They would rent it to them or sell it to them. And they were Walbridge Aldrich of Detroit, which is a well-known Detroit contracting company, did that work, built those houses. I thought originally they were catalog houses because they sort of looked like that size and style in, of course, the 1920s. But according to research, they were actually done by an architect I never heard of, and Bob you probably know. But Walbridge built these places under contract to this Wills real estate company. And the thing was, it was a very isolated place. You have to remember, in 1920, 21, even though today it's 5 minutes from Port Huron by car, that was a long wait when most people didn't have cars. And I don't think that there were, even at the time, any kind of trolleys that were ran from this site into the connected river. So you had to have housing for the people. And the plant employed several thousand people at its peak. And then, unfortunately, failed for a lot of reasons, as they say. A lot of people were left with houses but no jobs.
I mentioned Sea Harold Wills. He had a riverside mansion in Indian Village, so it's a vacant lot now. But
And a house here in Grosse Pointe on the lake, too.
Yeah, he had a house in Grosse Pointe.
He had a yacht.
He had a lot of money, he invested, he didn't put all his money into this thing. He made a lot of sound investments. So that when the automobile company failed, he kept on going, living well. I think died in 1939. He became a consultant to Chrysler before they bought his facility there. That facility had, among other things, at one point it was an aircraft for Buell aircraft, which were little sort of flying clear airplanes. They built very big. Interesting.
Anything else? Mike will be in the back signing books.